And thanks to Mose and Owen for having me here. We met actually in Ireland, in Cork, at a festival where there was too much Guinness and a lot of poets. It was fun. It's great that you're out here supporting an independent bookstore too. In the U.S. we're losing a lot of them, as you may have noticed. I've been in France a lot with the books, and in France they still have all their independent booksellers because they have a 5% limitation, like a price control. You can only discount a book 5%, not more than that. So Amazon has only 4% of the market, and there are over 600 independent booksellers just in the Paris area selling literary fiction and poetry and everything. And there are thousands of them throughout the country. And so what that means is that in every neighborhood in France, there's an independent bookseller, and there's a community of readers who go to that bookseller, meet each other and get married, come for 10 or 20 years for advice on books. It's just fantastic. And because of that, my first book of fiction, Legend of a Suicide, which had 3 reviews in the U.S., had 50 reviews in France. They have much bigger review coverage. And they even have primetime TV. I've been on 4 or 5 primetime TV programs talking about books. One was with a mathematician talking about a nonfiction book about math. I mean, I just can't imagine that on Thursday evening in the U.S. So it's really clear to me, comparing the U.S. to France, that what holds everything together is the independent bookseller. That's what creates the communities of readers, that allows for all the media coverage, allows a wider range of books to have a life and a book to have a longer life. And so if you lose them, you lose everything else, which is part of what Borders found out. Drive the smaller people out of business, you're actually out of business yourself, because people just don't buy books as much anymore. So thank you for coming out. I hope that you buy all your books from independent booksellers only, not from Amazon. Yeah, it's disheartening too. The first book I came out with in 2005, I visited about 30 independent booksellers on a tour around the country. 3 years later, when the next book came out, it was something like half of them were out of business. It was really discouraging. So anyway, you still have it good here. So this book, this is the UK cover, same book, but it's kind of fun what they did in the UK. They're all about gold foil and stuff, and different angles you can look at it in the UK. This novel is set in Northern California. It's set in Carmichael, which is a suburb of Sacramento, and also up in the Sierras. They go to a cabin, and that's where my grandparents lived. They had a white, old farmhouse and 10 acres of walnuts with subdivisions coming around, and it was a very hot, kind of burning landscape in the middle of summer, which is when the book is set, over just about 10 days. It's a book that's going to get me into a lot of trouble with my mother. She's always been very supportive of my writing because I've always written about my father's side of the family. So this will be a test. I definitely don't envy families. I think that who have writers in them, I think that a writer's the worst thing that can happen to a family, because you get to see all of your shame put out there for people to read in 18 languages. But in addition, those shameful stories have been transformed into some monstrous shape that's actually different than what happened. Everything in the books is fiction, but it has this background of emotional and psychological truth from what happened in the family, all of our most disturbing stories. So in the background of this, my grandfather beat my grandmother, and it led to favoritism and fights about money and all of that. And so certainly my mother will notice that as she reads the book. Also, we haven't gotten along always over the years, and so there'll be bits of that. So anyway, I wrote it in fear at the end. I didn't plan to write this book. I was writing something set 1,000 years ago in Anglo-Saxon England, and then I just started writing this one day, and 5.5 months later, there it was. And it's published almost in almost exactly the same form as I finished it that day. I've only added 2 or 3 paragraphs to it, is all, for editing, and a few line edits. That's it. So you get, the nice part about that is you get to read exactly what I got to discover in the writing. We experienced the same book. The bad part is that toward the end, I was realizing that, God, this is actually going to be a book, it'll probably get published, and I got very worried about whether my mother would ever speak to me again for the last 3 weeks or so. It really does take kind of a monster shape. For writing for me is really unconscious, and that's what I like about it. I like how out of control it gets. The first experience I had with that was when I was writing Legend of a Suicide. There's a short novel in that book, and I was supposed to, I usually don't say what happens in the books, but I'll just say what happens in this one. So usually I had a plan when I was writing. I had always been told that writing is about control. You have a plan, you have an outline. And so my plan for that novel was to end with my father's suicide. My father committed suicide when I was 13, and this was supposed to be my attempt to get as close as possible to him, to understanding him. And so it was supposed to end with his suicide, but partway through the boy kills himself, which is something I didn't see coming until I was halfway through writing the sentence. I had no idea that was coming. And I went back the next day. I planned to cut that and move along with my plans, because they were my plans, you know. And I read through the 80 pages or so up to that point, and it was like seeing them for the first time. I'm the one who wrote them, but that was the first day I understood them. There was all this pattern leading to that moment. So it was the first time I understood that writing is unconscious, that it has all this pattern to it, all this shape to it, and it has pressure toward a certain kind of direction and a momentum to it that's not necessarily what has been intended. And so ever since then, I've been trying not to have any ideas. I figure an idea is the worst thing that can happen to a writer, and that ideas are essentially small and limiting. And in some ways, this book is actually about how philosophy leads to brutality. So actually, the book itself is about the smallness of ideas and how they can betray us and make us monsters. And that, of course, is just autobiographical. I was a little monster in the New Age movement in the early to mid-'80s. I was in Santa Rosa, and I was doing fire walking and meditation and relaxation workshops and etheric surgery. And I actually tried to walk on water over and over, thinking, you know, as I crashed into various mountain lakes and hot tubs, maybe this time my feet will hold. You know? So I was a true believer. And it made me a monster, really. It made me so selfish. Because in the New Age movement, each person who comes into your life, each interaction you have is teaching you a lesson. And so there's a degree to which other people essentially aren't real. They're there to teach you some lesson. So it's like you're a protagonist in fiction, that you're at the center and everyone else has some relation to you, and they're actually there in some way as a mirror to you. And so I loved being at the center of the world and having the whole world about me. It was really fun, but it made me a little selfish. It definitely brought out the worst. So I ended up still wanting the same thing, because I liked that world, but I just did it in fiction now. Now I write fiction every day, and so I get to live again in a world in which the protagonist is at the center and everything's about the protagonist. But I just don't believe it in my real life anymore, which is sad and smaller, but I still like to write. It's fun. So I think that's probably enough. Enough, more than enough. Shut up, read. Okay.